Hello, I'm Dr. Parmi Giuntini from Otis College of Art and Design. Today I'm going to be introducing Realism, the first movement of modern art. We're going to be looking at some of the ways that early realist painters challenged the Academy conventions about fine art. In particular, I'm going to be talking about Gustave Courbet. He wrote the first manifesto on modern art, and his ideas dramatically influenced what artists should or shouldn't do in their new approaches. Let's begin by looking at the relationship between reality and modernity. The first inklings of change in art during the modern period were subtle, and they involved both subject matter and style. English artists like John Constable began sketching outside and doing very quick paintings outside. Ordinary subjects like farms and clouds, such as you see in Cloud Study. It wasn't easy to paint outside with oils then because they dried too quickly. So these are really small, very sketchy works. What is important is that Constable studied clouds closely, even read about them. So when he finished his very large landscapes like Salisbury Cathedral, the climate that he painted looked very much like the actual weather that day, even stormy weather. In France, Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot painted small landscapes like Forest of Fontainebleau from 1846, identifying the specific geographical area. Like Constable, Corot liked going to the actual site, sketching the landscape, but then finishing the painting in his studio. Artists were not necessarily interested in making grandiose statements about life, but they were interested in painting pictures of specific places simply because they existed. They were important to their country or their area. They were interesting to the artist. Rosa Bone Ork was a real anomaly. She was a female artist who preferred painting animals, often worked animals like horses or cattle, like this 1848 painting, Plowing at the Nivernais region. Not only was the subject considered inappropriate for a woman, she painted it with such attention to detail and very little interest in romanticizing it. Although technically it would fit into the category of genre paintings, that is, a picture that showed everyday life among ordinary people, it really focused on cattle, and that was considered a very odd subject for painting. This kind of deliberate artistic choice of subject and an interest in painting that subject as realistically as possible ultimately developed into the first movement of modern art called Realism. It's important to stop for a moment and remember that movements, like styles and categories, are determined by people, often art historians, but sometimes art critics. Identifying different kinds of styles or movements is a way of organizing information, artistic information in this case. In 1847, Thomas Couture painted The Decadence of the Romans, a painting that today dominates one wall of the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. Couture was an academic artist, and his painting of ancient Romans indulging in an orgy in some kind of fantastic architectural setting was considered the highest form of fine art. He used references from antiquity combined with recognizable gestures and figures from more contemporary paintings to depict a story of lush overindulgence, the kind of situation that could result in moral decay, regardless of the temporary satisfaction. This kind of moralizing in history paintings was well known and highly regarded. Much like the sophisticated political cartoons found in the New Yorker magazine today, these kinds of paintings relied on an audience who understood the historical connotations and their contemporary consequences. His work reinforced the established and revered social and political rules of the time. From an aesthetic point of view, the painting was a superb example of outstanding academic expertise. Elegant and idealized figures within a balanced and complex composition, complemented by elaborate and soaring architecture. The figures were well modeled, the perspective accurate, and the entire work had a very high finish, so that none of the actual brushstrokes appeared on the canvas. Couture was following the established rules for what and how artists should paint in order to produce the highest quality work. Not surprisingly, there were other artists working at the same time in France who were interested in painting different subjects. Subjects they believed were much more relevant to contemporary audiences. Two of these artists were Gustave Courbet and Jean-François Millet. We are going to look at some of their work, and it may surprise you that even though their subjects have a lot in common, their styles are very different. In 1848, just a year after Couture painted Romans of the Decadence, Gustave Courbet finished his picture, The Stonebreakers, and nothing could be more different. Where Couture was all graceful composition and elegant references to antiquity, languid nudes and erotic gestures, Courbet painted two poor French workmen, a father and a son, who were breaking stones which would be used for paving streets. It was low menial labor, and for academic artists and most of the Parisian audience, this was not a worthy subject for such a large painting. Courbet was a staunch socialist and a strong believer in a realist approach to painting. He even wrote a manifesto about realism, encouraging young artists to abandon formal training and academic methods, to paint what they saw as they saw it, to avoid literary themes and preparatory drawing. His revolutionary ideas and his political position made him persona non grata with the Academy, although he desperately wanted to show in the Salon. Unlike the smooth, glossy surface of Romans of the Decadence, the Stonebreakers was rough, since the artist used both a brush and a palette knife. The figures are hunched over, turned away from the viewer, and they don't look content. The artist made no effort to idealize them. He painted them the way he saw them, poor, wearing tattered clothes, chipping away at stone. This painting caused a storm of controversy, not only for its rough style, but because the subject matter also referenced contemporary French political and peasant upheaval, as well as invoking socialist theory, always a threat to established authority. The short, heavy, pigment-laden strokes made it impossible to determine specific details or figures. Courbet's technique, therefore, made it impossible to judge aesthetically by academic standards, and his choice of subject reminded the audience that the French lower working classes were not content. The paintings of Jean-François Millet also created a controversy when exhibited, but not for their style. The Gleaners is one of his most famous works, and this has been reproduced thousands of times. Three peasant women dominate a harvesting scene, complemented by golden mounds of wheat and a blue sky. Gleaning means to pick up the odds and ends of wheat that remained on the ground after the crops had been harvested, and it was back-breaking labor. Although necessary, since these were the poorest people in rural France, and they needed the bits and pieces of wheat. Not surprisingly, this kind of work was left to the women to do. Millet came from a very successful farming family in the Fontainebleau area outside of Paris. Although he did not have to glean any fields, he sympathized with the poor of his area. It was also a part of rural France that had a long association with peasant uprising, a fact that was not lost on the urban Paris audience for this painting. Millet used a more academic style to painting. His surfaces are smooth, the figures are rounded, he used Beaux-Arts perspective. The colors and the glowing blue sky tend to idealize what was really a picture of back-breaking work. Audiences preferred this kind of approach to pictures of peasants rather than that of Courbet,
because the styles soften the message and the controversial subject matter for wealthy Parisians who liked to escape to weekend retreats in the Fontainebleau area and did not want to contemplate political unrest among the peasants there. Millet focused on peasants for most of his career, making them the central subject of the paintings. For audiences familiar with 17th century Dutch painting, which also depicted peasant life in great detail, Millet's work offered a much more contemplative approach. His idealization of the peasant also heroicized the peasant, and that was controversial. Remember that buying audiences for these works were the wealthy, and many of them were uneasy supporting artists whose work heroicized the lower classes. Painting like The Sewer from 1850 and The Knitting Lesson from 1854 may seem very bland and formulaic to audiences today, but in the mid-19th century, these subjects caused concern. These two areas, subject and technique, generally constitute the terms of engagement between the avant-garde and the Academy. Remember, the Academy represented official art, which was more conservative. You may find it odd that a painting of a few women gleaning a field or a couple of men working on a road could make audiences feel politically threatened, since peasant revolt is not a cultural fear in the U.S. today. Nor are you bothered by a rough canvas or the lack of a completely rendered representational scene. The context of your viewing and understanding is quite different from a 19th century audience. Keep in mind that many people today feel threatened by art that addresses issues of sexuality or gender difference, by works that have no recognizable aesthetic quality. That sense of discomfort, that sensation that this cannot possibly be good art or art at all, is part of the cultural context that you need to be aware of. In the 19th century, there was a much stronger cultural and artistic sense of what was acceptable in fine art. Clearly, Millet's work were never going to offer the same kind of challenge as those of Courbet. Although both men shared socialist leanings, Courbet was far more vocal, and he irritated many more people with both his politics and his art. However, he produced a body of work that forced many people to rethink ideas about subject and style, and his influence on realism and modern art cannot be underestimated. We are going to look at just one more of his works, a painting that should help you understand how he continually challenged the status quo. This painting is called The Funeral at Ornans, and he finished it in 1849. It is huge, a little over 10 feet high and 26 feet long. In the 19th century, that was the size and scale that artists used for the most prestigious history paintings. And clearly, those were the kinds of paintings that were often purchased by the state for public exhibition or by aristocrats for private use because they needed to be shown in very large buildings or palaces. The subject of Courbet's painting is a funeral in the artist's hometown, and the participants are a group of peasants and working-class people, along with an acolyte and a priest. Ironically, there is no corpse, no coffin, just an open pit in the center of the painting. The many figures are occupied with a variety of activities. Women are crying, some people are walking to the open pit, others are moving away. Men stand around, mingling in groups. A priest reads from a prayer book, and one of the young acolytes gazes off into the distance. There is no clear indication of what moment in the ceremony the artist is depicting, although the mass of people in various poses does represent a convincing picture of a typical large funeral group. Some people are distraught, some are distracted, others are upset or bored, some are comforting others. The entire figural group is backgrounded by a long, low plateau, and above the group there is a looming crucifix. Paintings of funerals, especially funerals of ordinary people, were not typical subjects for artists. What was Courbet trying to say? At the very least, the artist was showing that the lives, the moments of loss, the sorrow of ordinary people are worthwhile subjects for the modern painter, and worthy of being painted on the same scale as a history painting, which was traditionally reserved for stories of gods, saints, and heroes. He is also challenging the idealizing conventions of academic art in both style and composition. There is no single focal point, no unifying composition, no devices to direct the eye to the center or to organize the groups. The figures literally peel off to either side. Despite the looming crucifix and the priest, there is no sense of salvation or comfort in the painting, a situation that is heightened by the open pit in the painting's center. In many ways, it was and remains a disturbing picture, one that reminds us of the reality of death and the ways that we cope with it. Like the Stonebreakers, Courbet was interested in showing his audience the reality of their lives and experiences without any superficial gloss to soften the impact. Courbet's work and his manifesto on realism urged a rethinking of what paintings could be, both in terms of subject matter. He famously believed you could only paint what you could actually see, and style. He abhorred the refined and elegant academic approach. Clearly, for the subjects that he chose and the meanings that he wanted to communicate through his work, the academic style would have been ineffective. Lastly, Courbet argued for a dismantlement of the academic system. Much like his socialist position on politics, he wanted to break the control that the academy had over artistic style, over training, over official taste. Courbet's interest in what and how individual artists wanted to paint was a gauntlet to the academy, and he was the first of a string of artists who consistently pushed against that established institutional authority throughout the 19th century.
You probably have a much better idea now of how one man, one very determined man, can raise so many issues about the future of art. Remember that in the middle of the 19th century, the art world was much smaller and much more controlled. Courbet's manifesto and public exhibitions were the only really effective way to get the attention of the audience and the art critics. It's important to remember, though, that the visual culture of the early modern world was influenced by one more critical factor, and that was the development of photography. Photographs made by a machine. Now that was really modern. In the next lecture, we'll look at the ways that photography changed the way that people thought about reality.